They don't love you because their ego tells them they don't need you. Every withdrawal, every moment of coldness, every time they create distance when you're trying to build closeness, it's not actually about you, or about the relationship, or about anything you're doing wrong. It's their ego protecting itself from the vulnerability that loving you would require. The avoidance ego is the defensive structure they've built to maintain the belief that they're self-sufficient, that they don't need anyone, that emotional independence is their core identity and strength. This ego structure is what stands between you and genuine connection with them. It's the wall that prevents them from receiving your love. It's the defense that reframes your care as pressure and your availability as suffocation. It's the mechanism that keeps them trapped in cycles of pursuit and withdrawal, where they can never actually surrender to the intimacy they claim to want. And here's the uncomfortable truth that most relationship advice won't tell you. You cannot love someone past their ego. You cannot be patient enough, or understanding enough, or emotionally available enough to make them drop the defensive structure that prevents them from loving you back. The ego doesn't respond to more love. It responds to its destruction. Not destruction through cruelty or manipulation or playing games. Destruction through the systematic removal of everything the ego uses to maintain its defensive position. The avoidance ego maintains itself through specific mechanisms. Your pursuit proves they're desired. Your availability proves they won't be abandoned. Your emotional investment proves they matter. Your tolerance of their patterns proves they can maintain their defended position without consequence. Every time you pursue when they withdraw, every time you accept their return after they've pushed you away, every time you adjust your needs to accommodate their limitations, you're feeding the ego that prevents them from loving you. You're confirming the belief system that says they can have connection without vulnerability, that they can be loved without having to love back fully, that they can maintain their defended independence while keeping you available for when they decide they want engagement. The ego is what makes them believe they can have both, the benefits of relationship without the requirements of genuine intimacy. And as long as the ego remains intact, they will never love you the way you need to be loved, because loving you fully would require dismantling the ego structure that's currently more important to them than you are. Destroying the ego doesn't mean attacking them or trying to make them feel bad about themselves. It means systematically removing the ego's supports, your pursuit, your availability, your tolerance, your accommodation. It means creating conditions where the ego cannot maintain itself because the external supports it relies on have been withdrawn. It means making them experience the full consequences of their patterns, rather than absorbing those consequences yourself. When you stop pursuing, the ego loses proof of being desired. When you become unavailable, the ego loses the safety net of your constant presence. When you stop tolerating their patterns, the ego loses the confirmation that defended position is sustainable. When these supports are removed, the ego begins to collapse. And in the space where the ego was, the possibility of genuine love can finally emerge. Not because you've convinced them to love you, but because the defensive structure that was preventing love has been destroyed through the systematic removal of everything that was maintaining it. The specific components of the avoidance ego that prevent them from loving you fully. The avoidance ego isn't one monolithic defense. It's complex structure with specific components that each serve protective function. Understanding what you're actually dealing with helps you recognize what needs to be destroyed and why. The ego maintains the belief that they're fundamentally self-sufficient and don't need anyone. This belief protects them from acknowledging dependency needs that their childhood taught them were dangerous to express. The core of the avoidant ego is the belief, I don't need anyone. This isn't just preference for independence. It's defensive structure built in childhood when emotional needs went unmet and the child learned that needing was dangerous, that expressing dependency led to disappointment or rejection or emotional unavailability from caregivers. The child adapted by shutting down the need, by becoming self-sufficient, by building identity around not needing. In adulthood, this became ego structure, a way of understanding themselves as fundamentally independent person who doesn't require emotional connection or support from others. This belief protects them from acknowledging that they do have needs, that they are dependent on connection, that they want love and care and emotional availability from you. Acknowledging these needs would mean confronting the childhood wound where needs led to pain. The ego prevents this confrontation by maintaining the belief that needs don't exist. Your love threatens this belief because receiving your love would mean acknowledging they need it, which the ego cannot allow. The ego uses your pursuit as evidence that they're valuable and desired without requiring them to demonstrate equivalent investment or vulnerability. When you pursue them, when you reach out first, when you try to close the distance they create, when you work to maintain connection despite their withdrawal, the ego interprets this as confirmation of their value. See, she's pursuing me. I must be valuable. I must be desired. I matter to her. This confirmation feels good and meets their need to feel significant. But it comes without cost. They get to feel valuable without having to be vulnerable, get to feel desired without having to demonstrate desire, get to matter to you without having to let you matter equivalently to them. The pursuit feeds the ego by providing validation that requires no reciprocal risk. This creates a situation where they can feel good about themselves through your effort while maintaining all their defenses intact. The ego needs your pursuit to function. Without it, they lose external validation of their worth and are forced to confront their own feelings rather than being able to use your feelings as proof of their value. The ego maintains control through their ability to withdraw, believing they can always create distance if intimacy becomes uncomfortable, which prevents them from having to develop capacity to tolerate intimacy. The avoidant ego's sense of safety comes from maintaining control through withdrawal. If things get too intense, I can always pull back. If I feel suffocated, I can create space. If vulnerability becomes too uncomfortable, I can retreat. This belief that they can always control intimacy level through creating distance means they never have to develop actual capacity to tolerate sustained intimacy. They don't have to work on their discomfort with vulnerability because they can simply avoid vulnerability by withdrawing. They don't have to learn to stay present during difficult moments because they can escape difficult moments by creating distance. The ego maintains itself through this control mechanism. As long as withdrawal is always an option, they never have to face the discomfort that growth would require. Your tolerance of their withdrawal reinforces this ego structure by confirming that withdrawal works, that they can create distance, and you'll still be there when they decide to return, that they don't actually have to change because their current approach successfully manages their discomfort. The ego reframes your legitimate needs as your character flaws, protecting them from having to acknowledge their own limitations by making you the problem. Your need for consistency becomes your inability to handle normal fluctuations. Your need for emotional availability becomes your neediness. Your need for commitment becomes your anxiety about the future. These reframings are ego defense mechanisms that protect the avoidant from having to confront their own incapacity. If your needs are the problem, they don't have to examine their inability to meet normal relationship requirements. If you're too demanding, they don't have to question whether they're insufficiently available. If you're the one with issues, they maintain their sense of themselves as fundamentally okay, while you're the one who needs to change. The ego maintains itself through these reframings because acknowledging that your needs are legitimate would require acknowledging their limitations, which would threaten the ego's core belief in their self-sufficiency and lack of need for growth or change. The ego uses intermittent reinforcement of affection, giving just enough warmth after periods of coldness to keep you engaged while never having to sustain consistent presence. Hot and cold cycles aren't just pattern, they're ego maintenance strategy. The ego needs you engaged, but at distance. Completely pushing you away would eliminate the validation your presence provides. Sustaining consistent closeness would threaten the ego's defended independence. The solution is intermittent reinforcement. Periods of withdrawal followed by periods of warmth. Just enough affection after coldness to restore your hope. Just enough engagement after distance to keep you invested. This pattern serves the ego perfectly because it maintains your presence and investment without requiring sustained vulnerability or consistent emotional availability from them. You stay engaged because the warm periods create hope, but you never get sustained intimacy because the ego cannot tolerate it. The intermittent reinforcement is how the ego has both, your ongoing presence and their ongoing defense. The ego maintains narrative that relationship is optional for them. I could be fine alone, protects against acknowledging how much they'd actually lose if you left permanently. Throughout relationship, the avoidant maintains belief, usually unspoken but evident through behavior, that relationship is optional for them. They could leave. They could be fine alone. They don't really need this. This narrative protects the ego from acknowledging dependency. If relationship is optional, then losing it wouldn't be catastrophic, which means they're safe from the pain of potential loss. The ego needs this narrative to maintain sense of invulnerability, but the narrative is false. They wouldn't be fine alone. They would lose something significant. They do need connection more than the ego allows them to acknowledge. Your continued presence despite their patterns allows the ego to maintain this false narrative because they never have to test it. They can continue believing relationship is optional because you continue being there, which means they never face the reality of what your actual absence would mean. The ego's narrative of optionality remains unchallenged as long as you don't actually make the relationship end. Why your love and patience actually strengthen the ego rather than breaking it down. The instinct when loving an avoidant is to love harder, be more patient, demonstrate more understanding. But this approach strengthens the ego structure rather than dismantling it. Understanding why your best intentions backfire helps you see what needs to change. Your pursuit, when they withdraw, confirms the ego's belief that they can maintain distance without losing you, eliminating the natural consequence that would challenge the ego's sense of control. Every time they withdraw and you pursue, you're teaching the ego that withdrawal works. They can create distance and you'll close it. They can pull back and you'll reach forward. This confirmation strengthens the ego because the ego's sense of safety depends on maintaining control through withdrawal. If withdrawal always works, if it never results in actual loss, then the ego's strategy is confirmed as viable and they have no reason to develop different approach. The natural consequence of withdrawal should be distance that they experience rather than distance you eliminate through pursuit. When you eliminate that consequence, you strengthen the ego's belief that they can control intimacy levels through withdrawal without paying the price of actual separation. The ego becomes more entrenched because its core strategy is being validated repeatedly. Your availability provides safety net that prevents them from experiencing the cost of their patterns. They can take you for granted because the ego knows you'll still be there. The ego's calculation is simple. Maintain defended position. Keep her available as backup. Never risk vulnerability because vulnerability isn't necessary when she's always accessible. Your constant availability feeds this calculation. You're always there when they want engagement, always receptive when they return after withdrawal, always willing to try again after they've demonstrated their patterns won't change. This availability means they never experience the full cost of their defended position because the cost should be losing you, but they're not losing you, so the patterns appear cost-free. The ego strengthens because the ego's core belief, I can maintain my independence while keeping connection available when I want it, is being confirmed rather than challenged. Destroying the ego would require making them experience the actual cost, which means your availability must be withdrawn so they face what their patterns actually produce, your absence. Your patience and understanding get reframed by the ego as evidence they don't need to change. If she accepts me like this, my patterns must not be that problematic. You're being patient because you understand their wounds. You're being understanding because you recognize their patterns come from childhood trauma. This patience and understanding are genuinely compassionate. But the ego doesn't interpret them as compassion. It interprets them as confirmation that change isn't necessary. If you accept them as they are, if you continue engaging despite their patterns, if you adjust your needs to accommodate their limitations, the ego concludes that the patterns are sustainable, that they don't need to do the difficult work of addressing their wounds, that they can continue as they are without consequence. Your patience, intended to create safety for their growth, actually removes the pressure that growth requires. The ego strengthens because it receives confirmation that its current approach is acceptable enough that you'll stay, which means the ego doesn't need to change anything about how it operates. Your emotional investment makes them feel significant without requiring reciprocal investment, feeding the ego's need for validation while protecting it from vulnerability of equivalent investment. The ego needs to feel significant. Your emotional investment provides this. You clearly care about them deeply. You're emotionally engaged. You're invested in the relationship. This meets the ego's need to matter without requiring them to reciprocally invest. They get to feel significant through your feelings without having to risk equivalent feelings themselves. They matter to you. This is clear and ego-satisfying. But they don't have to let you matter equivalently to them, which would create vulnerability the ego protects against. Your one-sided investment feeds the ego perfectly because the ego gets validation without vulnerability. Destroying the ego would require removing this validation source, making them experience what it's like to not matter to you, to not have your emotional investment, to lose the significance your care provided without reciprocal cost. Your tolerance of their hot and cold behavior confirms the ego's belief that intermittent engagement is sufficient. They don't need to sustain consistent presence because you accept inconsistency. The ego's strategy depends on your acceptance of intermittency. If you required consistency, the ego would be challenged because the ego cannot provide sustained presence without vulnerability. The ego is designed to prevent. But you don't require consistency. You accept the hot and cold cycles. You wait through the cold periods for the warm periods to return. You tolerate the inconsistency as part of loving someone with avoidant patterns. This tolerance tells the ego that its strategy works, that intermittent engagement is sufficient to keep you present, that it doesn't need to develop capacity for sustained intimacy because you'll accept sustained intimacy's absence. The ego strengthens because its core operating strategy is being validated as successful. Destroying it would require refusing to accept intermittency, requiring sustained presence or accepting permanent absence instead of tolerating the cycles that allow the ego to maintain itself. Your continued presence despite their patterns allows ego to maintain the fantasy that they can have relationship without vulnerability, the fundamental belief that must be destroyed for genuine love to emerge. The ego's ultimate fantasy is having connection without vulnerability, getting needs met without acknowledging needs exist, receiving love without risking love. Your continued presence despite their defended patterns makes this fantasy appear achievable. They do have connection. You're there. They are getting needs met. You provide support and care. They are receiving love. You love them clearly. And they've achieved all of this while maintaining their defended position, without having to be vulnerable, without having to fully reciprocate. The ego's fantasy is being lived successfully. This strengthens the ego maximally, because the ego's entire purpose is maintaining this exact outcome. Destroying the ego requires destroying the fantasy, which means making them experience that they cannot actually have connection without vulnerability, cannot get needs met without acknowledging needs, cannot receive love without risking love. The fantasy must be shattered through your absence, demonstrating that defended approach does not successfully maintain connection. It destroys it. The systematic process of destroying the ego to create possibility of genuine love. Destroying the avoidance ego isn't single dramatic action. It's systematic process of removing the ego's supports until the defensive structure collapses and genuine self can emerge. Understanding the process helps you execute it effectively if you choose to attempt it. Stop all pursuit immediately and completely. Let your absence destroy the ego's proof that they're desired without effort on their part. The first and most critical step is total cessation of pursuit. Stop reaching out first. Stop trying to close the distance when they create it. Stop initiating contact, making plans, maintaining the connection through your effort. The ego has been using your pursuit as evidence of their desirability without them having to demonstrate desire. Remove this evidence. Let them experience what it's like when you're not pursuing. The ego will initially interpret your non-pursuit as you playing hard to get or being temporarily upset. But as your non-pursuit continues, days becoming weeks, becoming months, the ego begins to crack. Where is the validation they were getting from your pursuit? Where is the evidence they matter that your reaching out provided? The absence of pursuit removes one of the ego's primary supports, forcing them to confront whether they actually matter to you or whether they only mattered when they were receiving proof through your pursuit. Become genuinely unavailable, not playing games, but actually building life that doesn't revolve around them or their patterns. The ego depends on your availability. Destroy this support by becoming genuinely unavailable, not as strategy to make them want you, not as game to trigger their pursuit, but as actual redirection of your energy toward building life that doesn't include them. Pursue goals that are important to you. Invest in friendships. Develop yourself. Create life so full that even if they reached out, your response would be delayed because you're genuinely occupied with things that matter more than monitoring whether they're finally reaching out. This genuine unavailability hits the ego differently than strategic unavailability. The ego can detect games, and games strengthen the ego by confirming you're still oriented toward them. But genuine unavailability, where you're actually living your life without them, this destroys the ego's safety net. They cannot count on your availability anymore. The fallback option is gone. The ego loses one of its critical supports. Refuse to accept their return after withdrawal. Breaking the pattern that taught the ego withdrawal has no permanent consequences. The ego has learned through repeated cycles that withdrawal is temporary and consequence-free. They withdraw, time passes, they return, you accept them back. The pattern has taught the ego that withdrawal is an effective tool for managing discomfort without cost. Destroy this pattern. When they withdraw, let them go completely. When they try to return, whether days later or months later, refuse to accept the return, not with anger, not with punishment, simply with clarity. I don't participate in hot and cold anymore. I'm building different life. This refusal shatters the ego's belief that withdrawal is controllable and reversible. They're discovering that withdrawal can result in permanent loss, that creating distance can result in distance that they can't close when they decide they're ready. The ego cannot maintain itself when its core strategy produces outcomes it cannot reverse. This forces them to question whether withdrawal is actually effective strategy or whether it's pattern that costs them what they want. Enforce clear boundaries about treatment you'll accept, destroying the ego's belief that your needs are negotiable or that your standards will adjust to accommodate their limitations. The ego maintains itself partially through believing your boundaries are flexible, that your standards will adjust, that you'll ultimately accept whatever they're capable of giving. Destroy this belief through enforcing non-negotiable boundaries. State clearly what you require from partnership. State clearly what behaviors you won't accept, and follow through completely when boundaries are crossed. Don't explain extensively. Don't give multiple chances. State the boundary, enforce it when violated, follow through with consequences. This enforcement destroys the ego's assumption that it can continue operating as it has been while keeping you engaged. The ego discovers that you actually mean what you say, that your requirements are real, not negotiable, that you'll actually leave rather than continuing to accept insufficient treatment. This forces the ego to choose, change to meet requirements, or lose you permanently. The ego cannot maintain itself when faced with this forced choice because the ego's entire strategy depends on never having to make the choice. Allow them to experience full consequences of their patterns. Stop absorbing the impact yourself and let the natural results of their behavior land on them. Throughout relationship, you've been absorbing consequences of their patterns. Their withdrawal hurt you, not them. Their emotional unavailability created problems for you, not for them. Their hot-cold cycles damaged your peace, while they experienced only mild discomfort. Stop absorbing. Let the consequences land where they belong. They withdraw. Experience the distance without you closing it. They're emotionally unavailable. Experience the isolation that creates without you filling the void. They create chaos through intermittent engagement. Experience the instability without you providing the stability that makes instability tolerable. When they experience actual consequences, rather than watching you experience them, the ego is confronted with the cost of its strategies. The ego maintained itself through externalizing costs. You paid the price for their defended position. When you stop paying and they start paying, the ego discovers its strategies are far more costly than it calculated. This realization is what creates motivation for change. Make them choose explicitly between their ego and having you, forcing conscious recognition that maintaining defended position means losing you permanently. Eventually, if they want to reconnect, or if they're experiencing the consequences and questioning their patterns, create moment of explicit choice, not multiple conversations, not gradual process, clear moment. You can continue operating how you've been operating, or you can be with me. You cannot have both. Choose. This forced choice is what destroys the ego most completely, because the ego's entire function was avoiding this exact choice. The ego wanted both, defended independence and your presence. Your patience and tolerance allowed them to have both. Now you're making it impossible. They must choose. And choosing you requires destroying the ego, requires acknowledging they do need you, requires admitting the defended position costs more than it protects, requires vulnerability the ego was designed to prevent. Most avoidants will choose ego over you. This is why this approach must be genuine. You must be willing to lose them permanently. But for the small percentage who choose you, the choice itself is what destroys the ego, because choosing you means consciously dismantling the defensive structure that's been protecting them their entire life. Why destroying the ego is the only path to genuine love but isn't guaranteed to work. Understanding the systematic process of ego destruction is important, but equally important is understanding the limitations and the risks. This approach isn't manipulation technique guaranteed to make them love you. It's the only possible path to genuine love with specific person whose ego prevents them from loving, and it often doesn't work. Destroying the ego creates possibility of love, but doesn't guarantee it. Their wounds may be too deep for them to choose vulnerability, even when ego's alternative supports are removed. Removing the ego's supports creates crisis. The avoidant must choose, acknowledge needs, and pursue connection vulnerably, or accept permanent isolation their defended position produces. This choice point is where genuine love becomes possible. If they choose to pursue connection, if they do the therapeutic work to address wounds, if they develop capacity for sustained vulnerability, genuine love can emerge. But the choice point doesn't guarantee this outcome. Many avoidants, when faced with this choice, choose continued defense. They choose isolation over vulnerability. They choose ego preservation over connection. They cannot make the choice for love because their wounds are too deep. Their fear is too powerful. Their nervous system cannot tolerate the vulnerability that loving you would require. Destroying the ego creates the conditions where love is possible. It doesn't create love itself. You cannot make them choose you. You can only create a situation where they must choose, and then accept that they may choose ego death over vulnerability with you. The process requires you to genuinely be willing to lose them permanently. Using these tactics strategically while hoping to get them back will fail because they'll sense the manipulation. This isn't strategy. This is genuine life choice. If you're executing these steps as tactics to make them want you, hoping that withdrawal of pursuit will trigger their pursuit, hoping that unavailability will make them value your availability, hoping that boundaries will make them respect you enough to change, they will sense the manipulation and the ego will strengthen rather than weaken because the ego will interpret your behavior as game. They can wait out. The process only works when it's real. When you genuinely stop pursuing because you've genuinely stopped being willing to pursue someone who doesn't pursue you. When you're genuinely unavailable because you're genuinely building life without them. When you're genuinely enforcing boundaries because you genuinely won't accept treatment that crosses them. The realness is what destroys the ego. The strategy maintains the ego. You must be willing to permanently lose them. If you're not willing, don't begin this process. Many avoidants will let you go rather than face their ego's destruction. They'll choose familiar defended isolation over unknown vulnerability required to keep you. The ego, when faced with destruction, fights back through choosing loss over change. I'll lose her rather than face these feelings. I'll accept being alone rather than acknowledging I need her. I'll maintain my defended position even if it means losing the relationship. This is common outcome, not because they don't care, not because you weren't valuable, but because the terror of ego destruction, of acknowledging needs, of becoming vulnerable, of depending on someone, is greater than the pain of losing you. They will often choose the familiar suffering of isolation over the unknown terror of vulnerability. This means destroying the ego often results in permanently losing them, not because the approach failed, but because their wounds were too defended to allow the choice for vulnerability. You must accept this outcome as probable. The approach doesn't guarantee they choose you. It only guarantees you're no longer participating in dynamic, where they get both defended position and your presence. The approach is emotionally brutal for you. Watching them struggle with consequences you're creating while maintaining boundaries requires strength most people don't have. Destroying their ego means watching them suffer, means knowing they're struggling with consequences your boundaries are creating, means observing their pain while maintaining the stance that created it. This is emotionally brutal. Your empathy will scream at you to relieve their suffering, to soften your boundaries, to give them another chance. Your love for them will make watching their struggle feel cruel. Your hope that they'll choose you will make maintaining unavailability feel unbearable. Most people cannot sustain this process because the emotional cost is too high. They soften. They accept breadcrumbs. They give chances that shouldn't be given. And the moment you soften, the ego is restored because the ego learns your boundaries weren't real. Your unavailability was temporary. Your enforcement was negotiable. The process only works if sustained completely. Most people cannot sustain it because the emotional brutality of maintaining it exceeds their capacity. Success means they do genuine therapeutic work and develop actual capacity. Not that they change temporarily to get you back, then revert when safety is restored. If the ego destruction succeeds, if they choose you over ego, the work is just beginning. They must do sustained therapeutic work, must address attachment wounds, must develop capacity for vulnerability that they don't currently have. This takes months or years of consistent therapy, of practicing new behaviors, of tolerating discomfort that growth requires. Many avoidants, even when they choose to pursue connection after ego destruction, don't follow through with the actual work. They do enough to restore access to you, then stop because the work is difficult. If you accept them back before sustained change is demonstrated, before months of therapy, before consistent changed behavior, before genuine capacity has been built, they'll revert. The ego will rebuild. The patterns will return. Success isn't them saying they'll change. Success is them doing sustained therapeutic work that produces capacity they didn't have before. Anything less is temporary adjustment that will collapse under pressure when their wounds are triggered. What this means for you, and whether you should actually attempt this approach. The systematic ego destruction is possible path forward with avoidant partner, but it's not appropriate or advisable for most situations. Understanding whether this approach serves you requires honest assessment of multiple factors. The approach only makes sense if the connection is genuinely rare and they've shown capacity for growth. Otherwise, you're investing enormous energy in person who can't or won't change. Before considering this approach, assess honestly. Is this connection genuinely extraordinary, or are you attached to potential rather than reality? Have they demonstrated any capacity for growth, any willingness to examine patterns, any openness to therapeutic work? If the relationship has been characterized by complete refusal to acknowledge problems, by total absence of self-reflection, by zero movement toward growth despite years of relationship, ego destruction won't work because the ego is too defended to crack under any pressure. This approach requires that some small capacity for growth exists beneath the defended exterior. If that capacity doesn't exist, you're not destroying ego to reveal genuine self. You're attempting to destroy ego, that is the whole self, and that attempt will simply result in them choosing isolation. Be honest about whether genuine capacity exists or whether you're seeing capacity that isn't there. You must be genuinely ready to lose them permanently, not hoping this approach makes them choose you, but accepting that permanent loss is likely outcome and being at peace with it. Before beginning, sit with the question, can you accept them never choosing you? Can you accept permanent loss? Can you genuinely build life without them, rather than building life as strategy to make them want you? If honest answer is no, don't attempt this approach. The approach only works when you're genuinely at peace with permanent loss, when you're genuinely choosing yourself regardless of outcome. If you're executing it as strategy while secretly hoping for specific outcome, they'll sense it, and the approach will fail. You must have already done the grief work, must have already accepted relationship might be over, must already be building life without them. The ego destruction happens as byproduct of you genuinely choosing yourself, not as strategy to make them choose you. The emotional cost is enormous. Maintaining boundaries while watching someone you love suffer requires sacrificing your empathy temporarily, which damages something in you, even if it works. Consider the cost to you. Watching them struggle while maintaining boundaries that create the struggle. Refusing to relieve suffering, you have power to relieve. Enforcing consequences that hurt someone you care about. This will damage your empathic nature temporarily, will require you to harden parts of yourself that are naturally soft, will force you to prioritize strategy over compassion. Even if it works, even if they choose you and do the work and develop capacity, you will have changed through this process. Will have learned to tolerate others' suffering while maintaining your own boundaries. This capacity is valuable and necessary, but acquiring it costs something. You lose some of the softness that made you who you are. Consider whether this cost is worth potential outcome. Most people are better served by simply leaving rather than attempting to systematically destroy ego. Clean ending is often healthier than prolonged process of ego dismantling. For most people in relationship with avoidant partner, the healthiest choice is leaving, not destroying ego, not attempting to create conditions where love is possible. Simply accepting the person you love cannot currently love you back the way you need, that the gap between their capacity and your needs is too large, that staying means accepting insufficient love indefinitely. Clean ending is simpler, less painful long-term, more respectful of both people's dignity. Ego destruction is prolonged, brutal process that may not work and that changes you even when it does work. For most situations, simple, honest ending is superior choice. The ego destruction approach is only potentially worthwhile when connection is genuinely exceptional, capacity for growth genuinely exists, and you're genuinely willing to lose them through the process. Otherwise, leave, build new life, find someone whose ego doesn't prevent them from loving you. You must destroy the avoidance ego to make them love you, not because you're trying to break them down, but because the ego is the structure preventing them from loving you, and that structure must be dismantled for genuine love to be possible. Their ego maintains itself through your pursuit, your availability, your tolerance, your patience. Every time you feed the ego's supports, you make love less possible. Destroying the ego requires removing all supports. Stop pursuing. Become unavailable. Refuse to accept hot-cold patterns. Enforce boundaries. Let them experience consequences. This destruction creates crisis where they must choose. Maintain ego and lose you, or dismantle ego and pursue you vulnerably. Most choose ego. For the rare few who choose you, the choice itself is what creates possibility of genuine love, because choosing you requires destroying defensive structure that was preventing love. But destroying someone's ego isn't relationship strategy. It's last resort intervention for genuinely exceptional connection with person who has demonstrated some capacity for growth. For everyone else, for most situations, leave. You don't need to destroy anyone's ego. You need to find someone whose ego doesn't prevent them from loving you in the first place. Someone who chooses you without requiring crisis. Someone whose capacity matches your value from the beginning. That person exists. That person doesn't require ego destruction to love you. They just love you. That's who you deserve. Not someone you had to systematically break down to create possibility they might eventually choose you. Someone who chose you without all that. Find them instead.